Although I originally hadn't, I now plan to watch the second season of Iron-Blooded Orphans. The reason for this is because I feel like the show's true intentions weren't apparent until near the end. Of course, you could complain that it should have made itself clearer earlier, but the fact of it happening late is still better than it never happening. What this specifically comes down to is overall tone. For the most part, Iron-Blooded Orphans came across as unaware of its mindless violence and the fact that the protagonists mostly appear to be infallible heroes of justice. This turns around towards the end when the show suddenly appears to become aware of how the protagonist is basically a psychotic killer with no emotion and how most of the main characters are out of their minds. Anyway, I'm somewhat surprised Mari Okada wrote Iron-Blooded Orphans considering basically everything else she's written involves melodrama with varying numbers of cute girls. This doesn't mean that Iron-Blooded Orphans doesn't rely on melodrama or cute girls, just that those elements are less essential here than in her other work. I still find it awfully strange that she was chosen to write a military-based story given her history. I wouldn't really consider her a bad writer, but I'm also not exactly a fan of her work. Iron-Blooded Orphans is probably a good enough example for why I think of her this way. I appreciate and understand what kind of story she was going for in Iron-Blooded Orphans, but the way the show ends up depicting each of its elements and how they progress over time ends up making it come across less effectively as a narrative. One of the easiest ways to exemplify this is the situation of all the main characters. As the title obviously indicates, they're orphans, and this is important in their backstory, as we're meant to feel sorry for the fact that they're orphans forced to perform military operations in an unfortunate part of the solar system. The show seems to think that this fact alone isn't enough to make it clear that they aren't well off, and goes on to pound it into our brains how sorry we should feel for these children. This is mainly gone about through making almost every single character who opposes them at any point to come off as a flat, unjustifiable asshole. The world of Iron-Blooded Orphans would be more authentic and logical if the characters were closer to being equally as ambiguous in their capacity for evil. Another major issue I have with this show is the use of the characters, as well as their behavior at times. It isn't that I find them to be particularly badly written characters, it's just that there's so many it's hard to know most of them that well. It feels as if the time allotted to each is so short that we really only get time to know a few of them, though the show seems to give off the impression that it thinks we know all of them. The large amount of names used along with my inability to remember who the hell many of them refer to makes me wonder if either I missed some large event where the characters all got significant introductions, or the narrative is overestimating how well the audience knows and invests into all of the characters. A rather puzzling decision here is the inclusion of a Mary Sue as a main character. It's as if Okada thought the only way to have someone willingly pilot the Gundam was make them as emotionless as possible, but also make him somehow possess good people skills, effectively giving him no flaws other than that he has no qualms with killing, though that barely gets any focus anyway. If you've ever met anyone who lacks emotional expression, it's probably the case that you assumed that they also have difficulty reading others. Mikazuki somehow avoids this, making him out as a huge cheater as far as personality goes. It's like if there existed a person who paid close attention to the emotions of others but was incapable of being emotionally affected themselves. But why exactly does it matter if Mikazuki's personality is impossible by normal means? It's simple, it's not in any way human. Relatability is hard to achieve with a character who does not in any way represent any sort of human condition. Though it is the case that it could be revealed later on how or why he acts this way, 25 episodes have still gone by without much emphasis or development of his character at all. If there really is some larger idea to his character, then why wasn't it revealed much earlier? If it was intended for him to be anything other than a boring, emotionless Mary Sue, then the best they could have done was indicate that that wasn't what he really was in some way. The only major character I felt had enough focus and also wasn't excruciatingly boring was Kudelia, since she actually has a character arc and acts like a believable human being. Even if she is a naive female lead who wants to help people archetype, something that isn't exactly a rare occurrence, she still has much more focus and justification in her actions than most of the other characters. The smaller conflicts of the show do have some merit to them, though only in the general outline of what they are, not actually how they play out. For example, two friends arguing about whether to do X or Y helps add to the emphasis on what each of these characters mean to each other and how both of their ideas can be both advantageous or disadvantageous. The problem with this, however, is that the progression of their interactions feels unnatural since there isn't a whole lot of background around the conflicts prior to it taking place, making it appear that the characters are acting in certain ways simply to progress the conflict, rather than it being in response to some well-known will or obligation they had. The convenience and oddness of some of the show's events make it fairly easy to call into question the logical consistency of the story, like how Earth rebels engage in a firefight with armed officials for several minutes in the background only for there to be no evidence of any death or injury shown on either side once the event returns to the foreground. Also, the rebels in this situation don't appear to be at all aware of what they're getting themselves into or capable of realizing that they've put themselves into a life or death situation. Though I guess naivete could be a common thing with these people given their situation. Basically everyone in the faction seems 80% unaware of what's going on, so it makes you wonder if these characters are actually grown men or mindless dolls. There were at least 2 times where one character blocked another character from being hit by something at just the right time. The question that always comes to mind when I see situations such as these is, how could they possibly move in front of them during the very small window of time in which they would be able to block such a quick projectile? It would take some immensely great timing and foresight to actually pull this off successfully, and this isn't even taking into account the fact of them only having one try at it. Aside from these moments, the show's action is surprisingly memorable due to how it is based around tactics and slower movements rather than a few dudes just coming in and killing everyone like some other Gundam shows tend to do. If I were to summarize the impression I got from the show as a whole, it would be that it was giving off the aura of being an impactful story and also somewhat achieving that, but that it was always just barely straying away from being anything special due to how it chooses to illustrate what exactly it thinks the audience should be getting from it in such ridiculous ways, as well as how most of the characters don't appear to be doing anything for most of the season. It's hard to feel sorry for unfortunate Martian children when generic one-dimensional antagonists are repeatedly throwing themselves in their way for some reason. Though I really doubt the second season will end up being all that great, I have the faintest hunch that it's going to be in a much different direction from the first season, so that might be enough to make it interesting.